Well, it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for coming to the U.S. Center. Thank you for all of your interests in the very, very important topics that are being discussed around COP-21. It is my privilege and pleasure to be up here with three distinguished panelists, and we're going to have, I hope, a very engaging dialogue, and we will have time to take some questions from the audience on the topic of climate resilience, which is what we're here to talk about today. So I think I'll start by just doing a quick introduction of our panelists. Then I'm going to say a few opening remarks for about 10 minutes, and then we'll get into a few prepared questions that I have for the panelists, and then your questions as well. Beginning immediately on my left, coming from about as far away as you can possibly come from Paris, France, is Alson Kelen from the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Yeah, well, it looks like you have a cheering section. Alson has stepped in to do this. The foreign minister from the Marshall Islands, Tony de Bruym, is now meeting with President Obama and the president of the Marshall Islands. So he's not going to be able to attend this session. He got a better offer. I can't argue with that. The president asked me to meet with him. Somebody else would probably be introducing them as well. He is at a very interesting job. He's president of the Council of NGOs for the Marshall Islands. He's also the executive director of traditional training skills for youth. So think about Polynesian navigation skills. And I asked him earlier today if climate change was impacting that, and I'll let that be part of a mystery to remain to you until we get to the Q&A. He was the former mayor of the Bikini Atoll, and that's a place with an interesting history where the U.S. government tested nuclear weapons. So welcome, Alson. We'll give him a quick round of applause. Thank you. Sitting next to him, also a very long way away, is Maya Lucan. She lives in the city of Kotzebue, Alaska, about 57 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle in northwest Alaska. She is half Finnish and half Inupiat Eskimo, and has been a leader in many, many ways. She is the tribal environmental manager of the Manilac Association in Kotzebue, and that is an association of the region. She is also a councilwoman. She and her husband have 4 children, and I think she will have a very, very interesting perspective on what they are feeling in the Arctic in very real time with climate change. Can we give Maya a quick round of applause? Thank you. And last but certainly not least is Lynne Scarlet. She is the Managing Director for Public Policy at the Nature Conservancy. She also is very familiar with my job. She was Deputy Secretary of the Interior for a number of years. She actually was the Acting Secretary of Interior through a changing of the guard in the Bush administration. She has been a leader in many ways on understanding landscapes, and now serving with the Nature Conservancy, co-chairing the Landscape Conservation Cooperatives Council, which is something that the Department of Interior established in 2014. So she's involved in climate change issues on a global level, and very knowledgeable about the political process in the United States as well. So please join me in welcoming Lynne. So I am honored to be one of a number of representatives of the United States at this conference. And I will say that I'm a person that came from the private sector, 35 years in the private sector, just under 3 years now in the public sector. And I was very committed to climate change running the company that I was with before this job, and that was a company in the United States called REI, or Recreational Equipment Incorporated. And we recognized that our business depended on a healthy environment, but that we were part of the problem in terms of our carbon footprint, and we set about changing that. But we realized that we couldn't do it alone. So when I stepped into the public sector and took this job, addressing the issues of climate change was one of my highest priorities, and I am very proud to work for President Obama, who has taken historic action on climate change. And I will tell you that I'm very optimistic in meeting with the leaders that I have met with here, and the commitment on the part of all of you to get to resolution of these issues and to hold hands and work together on a brighter future for our planet than we have now. And I will say that our panelists will help shed light on why that is important. So there's 2 things that we know about climate change. One is no country is immune to its impacts, although we've got some examples that are pretty dramatic up here, but also no country can solve climate change on its own. We need global action to reduce our carbon emissions, but we also have to work together to build climate resilience, the topic of this panel. We have been, in the United States, a leader in many ways, but we know we have a lot to learn from others, and we know we have a lot more that we can be doing. So I look forward to getting into that a bit more today and over the course of this conference. So when you think the term climate resilience, resilience means really the power or ability to recover after being disturbed. And I think it's very evident to the people in this room that we have disturbed our planet in a pretty profound way. But also, resilience is a term that is realistic. It acknowledges that climate change impacts are happening and they are being felt, and it also is a hopeful term. It's rooted in the concept that we can do something about the impacts to make our communities and our ecosystems stronger. So I'll talk about, yes, the impacts that we're feeling from the Arctic to the Pacific Islands and other points in between, because we need to grasp the scope of these issues. And I will say that one of my first actual international business trip took me from the North Slope of Alaska, the village of Kaktovik and Barrow, but in Kaktovik the runway was washing away because of coastal erosion, and I flew to the Marshall Islands. So that's about 70+ degrees north latitude to 7 degrees north latitude, where the runway was also washing away. It was a very, very powerful illustration for me in just basically one day to see the difference between that we were seeing on the ground in the Arctic and in the islands. But what I really want to talk about is what we're collectively doing to address these impacts. What's working when it comes to building climate resilience, and what can we do better? So the panel is going to share some wonderful perspectives, but before we get to that, I want to break down kind of three main areas that we're working on in the U.S. First, it's about mainstreaming climate resilience, thinking about it in everything we do. So that was a clear expectation for President Obama to each of his cabinet members and all of the agencies of the federal government, that we have to prepare our communities for climate change as we are also taking steps to curb our carbon pollution. We are working to mainstream this into every department's activities and every decision that we make. So he directed all of us to develop plans that anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions, and a few examples from Interior are how we are focusing limited landscape restoration dollars on areas that have the greatest impact. One of the biggest challenges we have in the United States, and I think it's true around the world, are invasive species. With climate change, we need to make sure that when our landscapes are damaged, like wildfire, drought, floods, that we're able to plant native seeds, and we do it in an area where those seeds can thrive, like in Valles Caldera National Preserve, where I was just a few weeks ago, where we had a devastating fire. We're replanting native species, but we're doing them higher in elevation so that they will thrive. So we have developed a seed bank to get the right seed in the right place at the right time, which will help make our landscapes more resilient. We're also paying attention to landscapes broadly, saying what are the critical areas we need to protect. Water supply infrastructure would be one of those. When you have a devastating wildfire, oftentimes that's followed by flooding events, which will completely destroy a water infrastructure if you're not careful. So we are prioritizing where we do pre-fire treatments and post-fire remediation to protect that infrastructure. And we're also getting a lot smarter about where and how to rebuild after extreme weather events. Just last year alone, the U.S. had 8 different weather events that cost in excess of $1 billion apiece. If you go back to 2012, of course, we had the devastating Hurricane Sandy, which we are in the process of addressing through $60 billion in investments to rebuild. But we're rebuilding a lot smarter. We're incorporating climate risk into how we fund recovery around housing, transportation, and disaster response, so that when we have future storms, they won't be as costly as they have been in the past. But more importantly, we did a competitive grant project to unlock the potential of the private sector, to unlock the potential of community partnerships. $1 billion went into that competition, and we've seen a number of innovative projects. The Department of the Interior, managing a lot of resources within the United States, about 20% of the landmass of the United States, learned tremendous lessons from Mother Nature during the storm. We mapped LIDAR before and after the storm. We knew exactly the elevations, and we could see that the natural infrastructure of wetlands and coastal areas and marshes absorbed the storm's fury. 22 miles of Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge in New Jersey alone took debris hit from, think about boats and propane tanks and all kinds of detritus washing up on the shore of that wildlife refuge, but we have seen Mother Nature respond very effectively, and we've learned that those green infrastructure investments that we make by keeping lands wild and supporting wetlands pays dividends in protecting the communities behind. So we too did a $100 million resilience grant to get communities to work together with us and to work together with each other to do things like stabilize beaches and restore wetlands. So that was the first area. Second, we're developing and sharing actionable science. You can't manage what you can't measure. There's a lot of science the United States develops. We do it in partnership with other countries around the world. And developing and sharing climate science tools is critical to the work that we do. And perhaps Lynne, when we get to her contributions, will talk a bit about how her organization is using that. Through data.gov/climate, you will find multiple data sets provided by the federal government that are freely available and accessible. We believe strongly in open source data. We know it provides extensive information, but we also know that it might not be as easy to use as it could be. So our initiative seeks to stimulate private sector innovators to leverage these data sets to build accessible tools for the general public. So how many of you have used Google Earth? I gotta believe everybody, just about. Okay, well, Google Earth, it's got Google in the name, but the data is brought to you by the US government. It's a good example of a private business using freely available data from the US government to provide a tool that we all use. Esri, another private company, is using lots of data, including NOAA's sea level rise, to help communities decide where to build out of harm's way. We believe strongly on the sharing of that data around the world. I was just at the GEO, or Group on Earth Observations Summit, with over 100 countries in Mexico City to talk about the work that we're doing collectively on data sharing. And we've made high-resolution topographical data available now around the world that helps countries track sea level rise and water shortages, including FuseNet, which stands for Famine Early Warning System. There is a dramatic drought going on right now in East Africa. It is worse than the drought of 1984 that killed millions of people in Ethiopia, but it is having a much less devastating effect because of the early warning system that we had and the work that the worldwide community has done to respond. So that's the second, is sharing actionable science. The third is partnering with communities, because addressing climate change is the work of every city, every community, and every individual to do their part. We are learning from communities, and we're also working to empower communities to prepare and adapt, and I think we'll have some examples of that up here. There's a lot that a satellite image, though, is never going to teach you, like the deep traditional knowledge carried by people who have lived in these places around the world since time immemorial. We have two wonderful examples of that up on stage with the Marshall Islands and the Arctic. So we're working to honor and capture that knowledge to strengthen our understanding of ecosystems and climate change. A great illustration of that was pulled together by the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium is called Local Environmental Observer Network, or LEO. It's a way for individuals, communities in Alaska to record abnormal events and trends, like where are the caribou migrating? What's going on with the weather? How's the permafrost melting? What's happening with the berries? What's going on with insects? We're seeing insect patterns change that are bringing disease and really changing very much the health impacts in many areas. So that local environmental observer network engaging citizen science is making a huge difference. So that's an effort that we are learning from, and we are hoping to expand throughout the United States and Canada and other regions of the Arctic, including into Europe, as we're chairing the Arctic Council for the next 2 years. So one of the challenges, and we'll probably talk a bit about that, is resources. There's a lack of resources, so we need to work together to bring those resources to bear. The Office of Insular Affairs, also part of the Department of Interior, which serves U.S. territories and freely associated states like the Republic of the Marshall Islands and others, has made climate change adaptation our #1 priority. And we have held meetings in island communities to talk to their needs and to address how we can best use the resources that we have. So I'll give you an example from Micronesia. We worked with them on a grant to conduct a vulnerability assessment of mangrove forests. They're important to their culture, they provide medicine and food, they serve as storm surge barriers, and they are a natural carbon sink. So that's one example of a small grant with many more that we are working on. We're also working with Alaska Natives and American Indian tribes across the United States on seed funding to help tribes get started on climate resilience programs on their lands and their reservations, including grants that we've done recently to Alaska Native villages. So that's a quick snapshot of the U.S. efforts to enhance climate resilience. We're mainstreaming it in everything we do. We're developing and sharing actionable science, and we're partnering with local communities. So we're proud of the efforts to date, but we know we have a lot more work to do, and we have a lot to learn from you and from our panelists. So I look forward now to engaging with our panel on what challenges and successes they're experiencing as we plan for and adapt to climate change. So with that, panel, are you ready to roll? Okay. I'm going to sit down here. I'll just throw out the first question, and I'm going to ask each of them to respond to kind of set the stage for where they come from and what's happening within their communities. And then we'll go a little more free form on the other questions, as well as taking questions from you. So first question to each of you, please. In my job as Secretary of the Interior, I see climate change impacts everywhere I go, as I expressed, from Kaktovik in Alaska down to the Marshall Islands. What is the most striking, surprising, and emblematic example of climate change for each of you in the work that you do? So, Alson, why don't we start with you? Oh, no, actually, we were going to start with Maya, weren't we? Start with Maya.
I think we already decided that we're going to start with her, so my story can flow better.
He's good, this one. I think so up in Alaska, we sort of decided we have a three-part impact. We have food security, dwindling ice, which is what he's going to talk about, and erosion. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about food security and our dwindling ice. Yesterday on Facebook, my uncle posted that the ice in front of Kotzebue today is 11.5 inches thick. And for the first time in 25 years, it's not more than 2 feet thick right now. And so that's over a foot difference in the sea ice right in front of Kotzebue on Kotzebue Sound. And the reason that he's been testing that ice hasn't at all been about climate change. It hasn't been about, anything else except for he wants to make sure that the ice is thick enough to race snow machines. So, looking at the ice thickness right now, it's not safe at all to drive a snow machine. It's not safe at all to collect wood. It's not safe at all to really be out there fishing. And so I'm glad that he has been checking that, because I asked him yesterday, I emailed and said, could you send me the last 25 years of ice thickness so I can use it in a presentation this week? And he's sending me that information. But he did say that it's about 1.5 feet thinner than last year. And so just that alone is going to show you, and for the last probably 5 years, he's said it's just been getting thinner and thinner by about a couple of inches here and there. And they've never had a problem racing snow machines on New Year's Eve is really what he wants to do. But dwindling sea ice, really, the issue that we have is that we hunt seals on the sea ice, and you have to be able to do that safely. And it goes right into food security when we talk about dwindling sea ice, because when I was a child, I was able to go out with my parents, with my uncles and my aunts, and I was able to learn for 3 weeks out on the sea ice, safely on a tent, in a boat, how to correctly, humanely catch a seal, process it out on the ice, and be safe. And the window that we have now is only 3 days. And so I can't let my children go out for 3 days and learn that safely. And I don't feel safe letting them go out there on the ice. And so we only allow, my 19-year-old son and my uncles and my cousins to go out there because they've already had that experience. But now my 12-year-old is not ever going to be able to do that safely because she doesn't have a chance to go there for 3 weeks and to learn correctly. And so not only is the window shortening because we don't have safe ice to be hunting on, but it is also affecting our culture because I can't let my 12-year-old hunt seals like I could let my 19-year-old hunt seals when he was 7 or 8 or when I hunted seals. So and we have a lot of food security issues related to climate change. Our largest one is with the Western Arctic caribou herd. Caribou is the #1 food that we use and that we eat, and seals and fish are a close second. So food security is really our #1 issue, and everything kind of relates to itself. Food security is really most important to us just because of the cost of living in Alaska. And to be able to scientifically and traditionally relate it to climate change has been a huge, it's not a relief, but it's been sort of a relief to be able to say, okay, this is what it's due to, and how are we going to adapt to that? And so we've done several things to try to adapt, but I think our biggest issue is food security with the migration changes, and then our dwindling sea ice, which you're going to talk about next.
Alson.
Oh, thank you. I just want to first say that I'm very thankful that I'm here to tell a little bit about our story. And Secretary Jewell talked about GPS. Well, can you look up on Google Marshall Islands, just so you know what Marshall Island is, where Marshall Island is, and what is Marshall Islands? It's a group of atolls and islands that are about 2,400 miles southwest of the Hawaiian Islands. So talk about the melting ice. The ice that melts in Alaska raises the water where I come from. So you talk about food security and migrations and all that affect our islands. A good example, in the last 3 months or so, we've faced westerlies we've never seen it happen in the past. Westerlies is usually come to the Marshall about 2-3 days a year, but this time, 2-3 months. So fishing, it's really hard for us to go out and fish. And that's our main diet. We are facing more and more king tides. So the water comes from the ocean, wash over our little tiny islands into the lagoon. So that causes lots of problems. One thing is the water. And of course, the water is very important to us because that's the only water source we have is the rainwater and the water lens, the thin water lens that we have on the ground. So with the water coming up from the bottom of the islands, and of course with the drought drying up the top, we have nothing. We have an airport in the main island that collect water when it rains. But it's really hard to collect the water when there's no water, there's no rain. And then, of course, what makes it even harder is that the king tide comes over the airports. Secretary Jewell also mentioned that I was a mayor at one time. I was a mayor of Bikini Atoll, and our main island is Kili. So Kelen is a small, I'm just giving a good example of a picture of what we're facing today. Kelen is a small island. It's like a rock in the middle of the ocean, where the ocean is hitting from every direction. So shipping cargo to this island, it's already hard. Most of the cargo, I usually say that 1/3 of the cargo that goes to the island goes in the middle of the ocean. So sometimes I joke around and I said, if you guys want to go shopping, go to Kelen and go on the water. You'll find laundry machine, you'll find canned goods and all that. Since 2011, we've seen more and more king tides affect this island very much, because not only the waves are hitting the island, but now it goes over the island. So the airport on the island, a lot of times, is underwater, 2-3 feet underwater. So if there's an emergency, there's really no way in and out of this island. And I'm only talking about Kelen because I know it very well. But the same effect that the stories that we hear about Kelen, is the same thing everywhere in the Marshalls. We see a lot of erosion. All of our food trees, like breadfruit. Breadfruit is one of our major tree of life. With the king tides, it actually killed the trees. So we're talking food security. That is a food security issue. Fishing, food security issue. So this is where we all need to work together and come up with a solution to figure out what to do for these people of these little tiny islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Great. Thank you, Alson. And I'll say that President Obama right now is meeting, as I mentioned, with small island nations to discuss just exactly this topic. And Lynne, Nature Conservancy does work in something like 40 countries, so you must have some great examples out there of where you're seeing climate change.
Yeah, thank you very much, Secretary Jewell. I'm going to take each of those attributes, striking, surprising, and emblematic, and say a few words. To me, striking takes me to Alaska. And while I was at the Interior Department, we looked at the future of the polar bear. That steeped us in the issue of sea ice melt. And I think for me, what was striking was the extent and pace of that sea ice melt. This was not a sometime in the future event. This was a now event, as Maya has described. But there was something else in Alaska that also struck me, and that was the thawing permafrost. I pause on that as something striking because that was not only an impact, and one that is ongoing now, but it's one of those impacts that actually presents feedback loops. As that permafrost thaws, so too does it actually then contribute to greenhouse gases, putting us in a kind of endless cycle. But let me turn to the surprising. Secretary, as you said, the Nature Conservancy operates in about 40 countries around the world. And I think surprising for me is the extent, variety, and scope of impacts that we are seeing. And these impacts are not tomorrow impacts. They are impacts today. Whether we go to the west of the United States, where we do a lot of work on forests and forest restoration, we see an extended fire season, and we see fires catastrophic in their dimensions. Whether you go to the coastlines where we do wetlands restoration, we see the sorts of sea level rise and challenges that Alson mentioned. In fact, it was those impacts that we are seeing now that really caused us as an organization to say, hey, yes, we've always been working on avoided deforestation and climate change in that regard, but we need to really ramp up, expand, and work all across the globe to address these. And then I'll end with emblematic, and I think for me, emblematic of climate change are the effects on water. It's hard to think of a community anywhere across the globe, and certainly anywhere we work, where you don't either see what's now being called hot droughts, changed precipitation patterns, earlier snow melt, which is, of course, the natural storage of many communities. So water to me is emblematic, and those impacts are now, they affect communities, they affect wildlife, they affect, frankly, our fundamental mission of the Nature Conservancy.
Great, thank you so much, Lynne. All right, so I just would throw this open to any of you that want to contribute. I talked a little bit about the importance of working together across communities, and really, if we're going to tackle climate change, it has to be a team sport. If any of you have any examples you'd like to share on what you are specifically working on to build climate resilience, to help your communities or broader address the very real issues of climate change, I'd love to hear a little bit about them.
Well, from the Marshall Islands side, because I'm just looking at this row over here, there are youth from the Marshalls that came to this program, to COP-21. And as I mentioned before, you know, they're the future leader of our country. And in our little islands, we don't see these kind of events. Yesterday I came in and I saw Obama, I saw, you know, Prince Charles and the whole 9 yard, the whole country. I saw them at the, you know, the giving speeches. It shows me how important this COP21 is. Now I can go back and explain the story, you know, just show the people, tell the people how important this COP21, how important we all are thinking and talking about the climate change. But having our young people here, I think is the greatest thing ever happened. Now they will go back, they're college students, they will go back and talk to their peers and share the stories and tell our country how important this thing is, so we can all try to figure out how we can manage and how we can move forward facing our climate change problems.
Thank you. Maya, if you have any, you don't feel obligated, but if you've got some examples of resilience, we'd love to hear them.
I think he gave an example of where the Marshall Islands are. I don't know if anyone knows where Kotzebue is, but President Obama visited Kotzebue as the first sitting president above the Arctic Circle. That's where I'm from. So hopefully you know where it is now. And we have, like Secretary Jewell said, I work for an organization that represents an entire region. So it's 12 villages in total. And we all understand that we're facing the same problem. So the main problem, of course, is food security. And then we say coastal erosion, but we need to say coastal and river erosion because our villages are on rivers or on the coast. And we have severe river erosion as well due to melting or lower temperatures or melting temperatures. So we are working together with all of the tribes in our region, coming up with plans to mitigate some of the things like the migration or the migration change of the caribou. So not only did the migration routes change for our Western Arctic caribou herd, but our Western Arctic caribou herd went from 400,000 animals in 2012 to 285,000 animals this year. And that is all due to warming temperatures in the calving grounds, forcing the cows and calves to move north faster, therefore creating, a high calf mortality rate. And so we have had to decide as a group of people who all need these caribou to make sure that they have, the high numbers so they can provide us with the food that we eat. We've, sat down together and created rules that we follow ourselves. So, we don't send out one hunting party per family anymore that catches 5 or 6 caribou. We send out, 2 or 3 hunting parties, and they catch like 12 or 13, and they distribute it to other people. And so we're not taking as many caribou as we usually would, and we're also only taking, bulls at a certain time, cows at a certain time when they're not calving, and things like that. And we've really tried to, it's really a reactive solution also. You know, a lot of these things that we're doing are really reactive because all of a sudden they're happening right now. So, you know, we're working with our tribes in our area and hoping to, you know, expand that to the north and in the North Slope and the south in the Bering Straits. And hopefully we can work with them to be, we're hoping, an example of, you know, just because it's legal to catch, you know, 5 caribou a day doesn't mean we're going to do that. You know, we're going to work together to try to make sure that the numbers are up, and we're going to only catch exactly what we need and nothing more.
Great, thanks. Lynne, any you'd like to share? Thank you.
Yeah, so the Nature Conservancy has really emphasized resilience and applying our skills to addressing the challenges of climate really around the globe. And I think there are 3 hallmarks of that work. One is science. The second is the sort of collaboration that we've heard discussed here, that is really engaging communities. And the third is nature, that is putting nature to work. And I'll mention just 2 examples. There are so many I could draw from, but in the state of Washington, Madam Secretary, your state, and I hope I get this right, the Puyallup River.
Puyallup,
Close. We are working on a floodplain by design effort. It's an area where in 2009, as many as 26,000 people had to evacuate at the time of a flood. And we began working with them to restore some floodplains, some side channels. Essentially, when these increasingly frequent high-intensity storms come, to put those floodplains back to work. And I'm pleased to say that through that work, in 2014, when there was a similar high-intensity storm event, just a handful of people evacuated rather than 14,000. But through that effort, a couple of key elements. We also worked with insurance companies, and as we began to put nature to work, these floodplains, the communities actually were able to get a rate decrease for their insurance. And then we began working with engineering companies who were used to thinking about addressing flood by building more levees, and instead getting them to think about putting nature to work and learning some of these nature-based solutions. Doing similar work in Ventura County near my permanent home of Santa Barbara, California. But I'll mention one other example, and that is in 30 cities around the globe, we have underway what we call water funds. And we're working with large communities, cities indeed, in Africa, in Latin America, cities whose water supplies are increasingly in jeopardy from changed precipitation patterns, and investing actually in watershed protection, in tree restoration, both to enhance the storage capacity of those forests in those watersheds, reduce sedimentation, and essentially provide water security for those communities.
Great examples. Thanks very much, Lynne. I'm going to open it up to the audience here. Ashley's got a mic, and we'll use the mic because this is being recorded. Any questions out there for the panel from the audience? There's one in the white shirt in the back. Raise your hand again if you could.
Great, thank you. I'm going to grab that question back, and I also want to remind our online audience, which is tuning in from all over the world, to hashtag AskUSCenter. I see a lot of fodder going on in Twitter, but no questions yet, so send in your questions. Hashtag AskUSCenter. Thank you.
Okay, please, your question from the back? Maybe you could stand up and tell us who you are as well, if you don't mind.
Hi, my name is Judy Drexler. I worked at the U.S. Geological Survey under you, Sally Jewell, and I used to work at the Forest Service, and I had the pleasure of visiting the Marshall Islands, and it's a beautiful place, and I saw how low it is, and even a rogue wave can wash over. What I really would like to know is, this is a wonderful panel, but we're really preaching to the choir right here. And there's a lot of people who need climate literacy. And there's a lot of people in our Congress at the U.S. who desperately need it, and the general public needs it too. We have 2 wonderful spokespeople here today who are experiencing it firsthand. How can we bring people like you to the public, to Congress, to get much more, just accelerate the learning process so that people can really see that this is real and it's not something that people are debating anymore. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for your work for USGS. Anybody want to take a crack at that? Maya, go ahead.
They told us to wait a second before it works. Thank you for your question. I actually was on my way to, I believe, a conference in St. Louis a few months ago, and I sat behind a guy, and he asked me, where are you from? And I said, Alaska. And immediately it sparks a, ooh, you're from Alaska. Interest in people. And he asked me, do you know the Eskimos? I said, yeah, I am one. And so we had this conversation, and he said, oh, you don't believe in that climate change stuff, do you? And I said, actually, I do. So, you know, he said, well, it's all due to X, Y, and Z. And I said, well, let me show you a picture of my house. So I took out my phone, and I showed him a picture of my house. And I said, this is the house that I grew up in. I always get a little bit emotional when I talk about this. So this is the house that I grew up in, and in 10 years it won't be there anymore because it'll be gone. It's, you know, the ocean is 5 feet away from it now. So it'll be gone. So the house that I grew up in, my children will not see, and my grandchildren will not see. And I said, that's why I believe in this climate change stuff. I said, so if you need me to show you that it's really happening, I invite you to come to Kotzebue, and I invite you to come to Kivalina, and I invite you to come to Noatak, and I invite you to come to where I live, and I want you to go and visit the people that it's affecting every day right now. And so he said, wow, okay, I'm really sorry, you totally changed my mind, and can I get that picture? And I said, sure, I'll forward it to you right now. And so I sent him the picture. I sent him probably 25 other pictures, just of things like being able to go hunting when I was 8 years old, and my children can't do that because it's unsafe. Things like being able to process your own food, and we're not able to do that because it's, you know, unsafe or the numbers are low, and we're going to give, you know, our family decided that we're only going to take 4 caribou this year, even though we need about 12 every year, and we're going to subsidize with, you know, chicken and other things like that, because we decided, you know, we have the means to do that, but we want that caribou herd to grow. And so I think, and I do go to other places and, you know, talk about things like this, and show that, you know, those same pictures. So I think, and I totally agree with you, we're always preaching to the choir, you know, about climate change, but, you know, you only have to change one person's mind. And if I can change one person's mind on a plane, and I can change one person's mind, you know, giving a presentation or on the web, you know, then I think that we're doing an okay job. I do encourage people to maybe visit where it's really happening right now, because a lot of times when you're in a place where you can't see something with your eyes and you don't experience it with, you know, your culture, your customs, or, you know, your life basically, then it's hard to believe. What you can't see, it's hard to believe. And, you know, we see it, we live it every single day, so it's very easy for us to believe.
So telling those stories is so absolutely critical. And one of the things we've done at the Nature Conservancy in the last year and a half is to launch a 50-state climate strategy. And we have 1,400 trustees, gathered around in all those 50 states. These are farmers, they're ranchers, they're fishermen, they're people of multiple communities. We're in Alaska. And we have been taking those trustees with their voices up to the hill to actually tell their stories, those farmers talking about sustained and hot drought. those people in communities that have seen flooding again and again. And in fact, we just had 200 meetings with members of Congress taking our trustees with their voices to try to tell stories like Maya's.
Thank you, Lynn. Alson?
Yeah, thank you. I think there should be more meetings, or there should be more people going out there and tell our stories. The thing is, like for the Marshall Islands, people ask me, so where are you from? I said, Marshall Islands. This is, excuse me, where is Marshall Islands? Thank God for Googles, of course. But we need to go out more and tell our stories. And people that hear about climate change need to also not just read about climate. I mean, they need to really look at the people, read about the people that really get affected by climate change. I'm actually doing a canoe program in the Marshalls. And part of my program, I'm working with the youth, utilizing the canoeing culture. So we are teaching our young people about canoes, about our culture, about what the culture that we've been surviving on these little islands on for the last 2,000 years. A very strong culture. Today there is a voyage around the world. The Polynesian Voyaging Society, Hokulea, is circumnavigating the world using the stars and the waves to navigate. And their part is to, what they're doing is they're doing climate change awareness. So there should be more of those kind of program. And we should also, that kind of story, we should also spread so everybody around the world will hear more about it.
Great examples, thank you. And Ashley tells me we have a few that have come in online, so why don't you read the first one?
Perfect. Okay, we have two questions here. First, from Jesse Gallen from the Nature Conservancy. I just saw that President Obama announced $30 million for climate risk insurance in the Pacific, Central America, and Africa. What kind of implications can risk insurance and other tools have for this topic? And maybe I can just offer the second question. Second question is from Victoria Barrett. My family is indigenous in a coastal area. How do I make sure that they're educated on sea level rise when they lack a lot of this information?
Great. Okay, Lynn, do you want to start with that first question, do you think? It's about the climate risk insurance. I'm happy to talk about it as well, either way.
Yeah, so we have viewed insurance as extraordinarily important in the picture of climate change. And our particular focus has been twofold. One, to really get the insurance industry, not only, of course, as they already are doing, motivated by the bottom line and worrying about the effects on them from these large natural disasters, but also trying to get them to recognize that nature's solutions can actually reduce risk and potentially, therefore, result in rate reductions in communities. So I mentioned this circumstance in the state of Washington, but also we're working with Mexico on some insurance tools and so forth. So critically important.
Yeah, I think that it's very clear that we will have an opportunity with the insurance industry to make it in people's best interest to take climate change into account and take increased risk into account, from making their homes fire-wise in terms of the risk of fires, resilience projects around drought. It's a very significant hammer, and I'm glad the President referenced that today. On the second question from the Indigenous person living in a coastal community, how can we do a better job about educating people within those communities about the issues? Would anybody like to jump in? Maya?
I happen to be an Indigenous person from a coastal community also. I think, some of the things that I said earlier, what you can't see, it's hard to believe, or it's hard to understand. And so a lot of times if you can't see something right in front of you, you think maybe it's not happening here, or maybe it's not happening to us. And so if you can see coastal erosion is coming right now, you can see it's washing away roads. It's, You know, in Kotzebue, we had a severe coastal erosion problem, and we band-aided it for several years, for 29 years or 30 years or something like that. And then we eventually built a $44 million road for 4,400 lineal feet. So for the math majors out there, that's $1 million per 100 feet. And that's how much it costs to build in the Arctic. So we could see that it was happening, so everybody, you know, in our community didn't need to be educated. You just lived it. You know, you had the problems, they closed the roads, we band-aided it. We had the problems, they closed the roads, we band-aided it. And then eventually we built the $44 million Shore Avenue project, and we've never had a coastal erosion problem since then. Now, what we did do is take away a lot of subsistence use areas and boat mooring, and so we've had to figure out something else for those issues. But educating an Indigenous family in a coastal area on coastal erosion, I think as long as you're there, it's going to happen to you. You know, we have the data that says that sea levels are rising, and if you don't have an erosion problem yet, good for you. I'm happy for you. But the truth is that most places that live on the coast, especially in where Indigenous people are, they have an erosion problem. We have coastal erosion, we have river erosion, and if somebody really wants to get educated, they should just look up Kivalina, Alaska, Shishmaref, Alaska, Newtok, Alaska. There are severe coastal erosion issues happening in those villages where the entire village is going to have to move. And, you know, where I say in 20 years my house isn't going to be there, next year their house is not going to be there.
Go ahead, Lynne.
You know, one of the things that we are doing at the Nature Conservancy is to deploy our science, and we've developed something called a coastal resilience tool. And working with communities, and through that tool, being able to show what the current risks look like, but then also peer into the future and look at what future conditions might look like, and then also to help people think about solutions, to look at how different options for trying to protect your coasts and your communities might differentially perform. And we've found that that tool is extraordinarily helpful because sometimes, as Maya said, it's hard to see the immediate and small steps. You want people to be able to peer into the future and see what tomorrow also looks like.
Thank you, Lynne. I'm just going to say that there are a number of programs out there that I think will help address this issue. We live in a time of social media. As a number of you are recording this on your devices right now, you're taking pictures, so probably a number of you have tweeted about some of the things you might have heard here. And I take that as a great hopeful sign that we will have more people engaged in citizen science, more people recording what they see, as I mentioned the Leo project up in Alaska. In the United States, we have a program called Every Kid in a Park. Every fourth grader in America, free pass to all of America's public lands for a full year with their families, but we're also gearing the curriculum for those fourth grade classes toward recognizing the value of public lands. And as they come out, climate change will be frequently one of the topics that's discussed. So I'm optimistic about the future, and I want to wrap this panel up by talking to the whole panel here with a few closing remarks. I said resilience in my comments to open is an inherently hopeful word. So what about your current work makes you hopeful or optimistic for the future? Who'd like to start?
Well, as I mentioned before, I co-founded this program called the Canoes of the Marshall Islands, and I work with the young people to keep this culture that we inherit from our ancestors going so we can survive. We're very optimistic, and I think this is kind of, it sounds crazy in a way, because if you look on Google what the Marshall Island is, it looks pretty scary. But we say that we will fight until it's not livable. But we're not ready to move. We're going to fight all the way. And that's where we need your help to fight with us so our islands can stay afloat and livable for the next 2,000 years.
Thank you.
I think what makes me excited is programs like this where your youth comes along. I was disappointed and happy. I was disappointed that none of our youth from our area could come, but I was very happy to see that a young man, Esau Sinuk from Shishmaref, was able to come here. And I don't know where he is, but I've been trying to Facebook stalk him to try to get a hold of him and talk to him and say hi. But you know, he took it upon himself to look for ways to come to places or come here and tell their story, because Shishmaref has the same story as Kivalina, you know, and Newtok, Alaska. And I'm very optimistic that, you know, we have great youth in our area, and they're not 38 years old like me just trying to convince people it's happening. You know, they're young enough to say, this has been happening my whole life. This has been happening my entire life. You know, luckily for me, I can say when I was a child, this is what was happening and this is what's happening now. But the youth in our area make me inherently optimistic about pretty much everything. And I'm just excited that, you know, they are going to be able to take what we've learned, and they're going to be able to, you know, I feel like youth are way smarter than us just technologically anyway, and they're going to be able to do things like make videos and post them real time. You can see it right now. And so then maybe we don't have to travel all over the place, which it would be nice, but we don't have to travel all over the place to tell our story, because our youth have already done it. It's done. They've done it right now. We can look on YouTube and watch it, you know, from a classroom in Atlanta. And also, you know, I just really appreciate that people are acknowledging that it's happening right now. And there are funding agencies in the government. It has a lot of funds available to build adaptation kits. You know, the BIA gave out last year a lot of money for adaptation planning, and that's really what we need. And so because you know, we're all acknowledging that it's happening right now, there's a lot of funding coming up, especially in the United States, that, you know, if you apply for it and you get it, then you can help the people in your area. For me, we can help the tribes in our area where maybe they wouldn't have that opportunity to be able to get that funding. We, you know, are a consortium, a nonprofit consortium, so, you know, we can get the funding on their behalf and then give it to them and help them build this adaptation plan. And then when you brought up the toolkit, there's a climate resiliency toolkit also. And so I'm just, you know, I'm optimistic that, you know, we have really good youth leaders, we have funding available, and we have people who are acknowledging that it's happening. And then I forgot my last whole part. But I think that's really good. You know, funding available, we have good youth. Oh, our technology, you know, and we have youth that have really good technology that can really help us get our stories out.
Great. Thanks, Maya. Lynne?
So, in keeping with the term resilience, my optimism comes from a combination of the incredible passion and creativity of people and the power of nature's solutions. So I look, for example, at the farmers we're working with in Brazil who are striving for agricultural practices that will avoid deforestation and limit their footprint. I look at communities along the Gulf Coast in the United States working with us on oyster reef restoration that benefits their heritage of fishing and the oystermen, but at the same time, those practices also are creating more resilient communities. So that passion, that creativity, sometimes that creativity is really with sophisticated finance tools. I haven't mentioned an effort that we have going on in Seychelles. We have a first ever adaptation debt swap. Now, I won't go into the devilish details because it's a pretty complicated tool, but the idea is to deploy some new financing tools to help that country with adaptation, but at the same time with economic opportunity. And then let me close with the power of nature. I'm optimistic because when we think about nature and actually reintroduce nature as part of the solution, as we see whether it's in floodplain restoration, those oyster reef restorations, we're helping communities be more resilient. At the same time, we're helping to sustain biodiversity, the habitats on which all life depends.
Thank you, Lynn. I will say, just to wrap for all of us, not only thank you for coming to this session, but thank you for coming to this conference. I'll say I'm optimistic and hopeful because we are all here representing almost 200 countries across the world, representing countries that have already signed up to reduce their carbon emissions. And I'm optimistic on the communications front because the heads of state of so many countries are here and they're spending time talking about why this is important. So it's all over the news, all over the world, and it will put pressure on each country to step up and be bold in its climate goals. It's going to be online. It already is online. All of this is happening in real time. And I think that that will have an awakening effect like no other COP meeting in the past has had. So I remain optimistic that we will get where we need to get in this 2 weeks, but that also by engaging the next generation, which has been a priority for President Obama, clearly a priority for everybody on stage, that the solutions will be forming as we work closely together. So could you please join me in a round of applause for our panel? Thank you so much for coming today.